Today, I'm going to talk briefly about a process called meiosis, very similar to mitosis, but not to be confused. So, meiosis is still a process of dividing a cell, or more specifically, dividing the DNA within a cell. But it's going to result in a different type of cell. Specifically, it's going to result in our sex cells, sperm and eggs. So we're going to see how this process is just slightly different than mitosis, very similar but slightly different to produce a different type of cell in our body. Just really quick, we're going to review a little bit about chromosomes, just the basics again, since meiosis is all about dividing up our DNA or dividing up our chromosomes. So the first thing is just to remind you that chromosomes are just condensed down pieces of DNA. You can see in this diagram we have 23 pairs of chromosomes, or 46 total. And you can remember that these chromosomes come in pairs because we get one from our mom and one from our dad. So right here, chromosome 1, we got a copy from mom, a copy from dad. Chromosome 2, we got a copy from mom, a copy from dad. And that's why our chromosomes inside our cells, our DNA inside our cells, comes in pairs. And we also want to remember that before we ever divide a cell, our DNA has already been copied. It gets copied during the S phase of the cell cycle. So before we enter mitosis or meiosis, we already have our DNA duplicated. And you can kind of remember what that looks like here. Here's a chromosome, a single chromosome. This is it in its unduplicated form. And again, you usually don't see this because DNA is duplicated, or when DNA is unduplicated, it's not really condensed down into a chromosome. But for illustrative purposes today, this is what an unduplicated, a single piece of DNA would look like. And then once it's been duplicated in the S phase of the cell cycle, it takes on the shape of this S. So whenever you see DNA in the shape of this X, that's DNA that's been copied. There's a single copy here and a single copy here. And these two copies, we call them identical chromatids because they're the same DNA, and they're held together at the center there. So really quick, let's go back a second to mitosis. So remember that mitosis is how we made our regular cells for our body. Whether we got a cut, we were growing, we were healing. Mitosis was the way that our body just makes new cells. And what happens, and we're going to kind of introduce a new term here, but in mitosis, we create what we call identical diploid cells. And diploid just means that there are two sets of chromosomes. So again, you get one from mom, one from dad. Two copies of one, or two copies of two copies of chromosome 3. You have two copies. We call that diploid. So after mitosis, we have our DNA that's copied. It gets packed into the chromosome, and it gets split apart to go back to the original amount that we started with. So if our original cell had, let's just say, one chromosome, a copy from mom, a copy from dad, we would duplicate those chromosomes, but then split them up again. So the cells that we end up with, we'd end up with two cells, but each one would still have one copy from mom, one copy from dad, and we end up with the exact same thing that we started with. Now we're going to take a look at how meiosis is just a little bit different. So again, meiosis is making our sex cells, our sperm and eggs. Meiosis is going to just produce kind of these cells that we call haploid. And haploid stands for half, but it really means that we only have one set of each chromosome, or one of each pair from those chromosomes. You could say that it has a half set of DNA. So let's imagine we start off with a regular cell over here, one chromosome, a copy from mom, a copy from dad. One pair of chromosome, a copy from mom, a copy from dad. We're going to duplicate those chromosomes. And then what we're going to do is, instead of just splitting them up and returning back to the original, we're going to split up the pairs and then split up the copies. So you can see our cell that ends at the end of meiosis, instead of having a copy from mom and a copy from dad, it only has one copy. So say one copy of chromosome 1 or one copy of chromosome 2. And you'll see this again in a picture in a second to make a little more sense. So just to compare them really quick, mitosis makes somatic cells our body cells. So it's just how we repair our broken cells or how we grow. And those cells are diploid, meaning they have two copies of each chromosome. So 23 chromosome pairs, or 46 total. Meiosis is making gametes or sex cells, our sperm and eggs, and they only have half a set of DNA. So one copy of each chromosome. So they actually only have 23 chromosomes total, one from each pair. You can see here, this is a great way to illustrate what meiosis does. This is your regular cells with 23 pairs or 46 chromosomes. It's just going to take one copy from each pair, so you end up with a half set of DNA. You're missing the other pair from each group. So you only end up with 23 instead of 46 chromosomes. Now, the question is, why would our body want to create cells that are haploid? Why do we want to create cells that have half? Well, if you think about the goal of this is to make sperm and eggs. And what do sperm and eggs do? Well, they come together. So when they come together, they form a full set of DNA again, and they make a baby. So here you can imagine an egg with 23 chromosomes, a sperm with 23 chromosomes, and together they come together to make a full set, a diploid set again, an original cell of 46. And we call this a zygote. This will eventually be what will grow up to be a baby. So the 23 and the 23, these two half sets, serve a function. So now let's briefly go over the process, and we're not going to spend too much time on this. How do we actually go about going through this process of meiosis and making cells, sex cells, gametes, with half the number of chromosomes? How do we do that? So the way we're going to do that, we're going to take this full set of DNA and split it into half. We're going to actually go through the process of meiosis twice. This is what I kind of illustrated before. So let's say, again, you have an original cell that only has one chromosome, a copy from dad and a copy from mom. You'll duplicate those chromosomes in the S phase. So here they are as X's. But then what you're going to do is you're going to split up the pairs. This is called meiosis I. Once those pairs are split up, it looks very similar to mitosis, where you split up the copies. And you can see here now you end up with cells that have half the number of chromosomes. You started up here with a pair, 2 chromosomes total, and each cell here just ended up with half. So again, what you're going to do is you're going to divide your cells twice. And so scientists do this. They break it up, and they break meiosis up into 2 stages, meiosis I and meiosis II. So because we've already learned the 4 phases of mitosis, meiosis is the same way. What we're going to do is we're going to go through prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase. And this time they're labeled prophase 1, metaphase 1, anaphase 1, telophase 1. And that's, again, because we're going to go through meiosis twice. We're going to divide ourselves twice to produce cells that only have half a set of DNA. So here you can see what meiosis I looks like. And like I said, it splits up the pair of chromosomes. So very similar to mitosis, prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and then telophase, the 2 cells will split up. It's not in this diagram. One thing to notice is that the really only difference is instead of all the chromosomes lining up in metaphase, the pairs kind of get together to be split up in anaphase. So we're just splitting up kind of, you could call it the brother and sister chromosomes there. So if this is meiosis, after meiosis I, what we end up with is we just end up splitting up these duplicated chromosomes. So a cell would only have 1 copy of 1, 1 copy of 2, 1 copy of 3, 1 copy of 4, but still duplicated. So then meiosis II is when we go through these phases again, prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase. Now we just call it prophase 2, metaphase 2, anaphase 2, telophase 2. And then we kind of just go through the same process as mitosis, where we actually split up the copies. So here you can see in metaphase, they line up, they get split apart in anaphase, and then you get cells at the end. Now, this is important because in meiosis I, we already split up the cell once. When we enter meiosis II, we have 2 cells that go through meiosis II. So at the end, when they split up again, you end up with a total of 1, 2, 3, 4. This is a little different than mitosis, where you ended up with 2 cells. So let's quickly compare mitosis and meiosis together. If you look at this diagram, this is a perfect way to illustrate. Mitosis, for our body cells, we start off with a cell that's 2N, has 2 copies of each chromosome, and we just divide it once. So we end up with a product of 2 cells, and they both look identical to the original. In meiosis, we go through the process twice. So we split it up once, we split it up again. We end up with 4 cells instead of 2. So every time you go through meiosis, you make 4 sperm or 4 eggs at a time. And again, they only have a half set of chromosomes. We label that as 1N. What else is different? Well, when we go through meiosis versus mitosis, mitosis produced identical cells. So when you make a new cell to heal or to grow, that cell is genetically identical to the parent that made it. Your 2 cells split, and they look exactly like the original. But what happens is when we go through meiosis, we actually end up with genetically different cells. One thing that's interesting to point out about meiosis actually is that although you do make 4 genetically different cells, only men actually do this. So when men go through meiosis and they make their sperm, and they go through these 2 cell divisions, they make 4 sperm. When females do it, they don't actually make 4 eggs. They actually only make 1. 3 of them die off, and the whole reason this is just to make the eggs stronger and healthier. So even though you go through all these cell divisions, 3 of those cells just kind of die off, and only 1's really kept, which is kind of something interesting. And then the last thing to note is that just mitosis is a form of asexual reproduction in that it produces clones. So the previous cell, again, is identical to the last one, whereas meiosis results in cells that are used for sexual reproduction, which gives you your genetic differences as you kind of go throughout a family tree.